much for that very kind introduction, and it's wonderful to be back. I started coming to this seminar about 30 years ago as a PhD student. I'm allowed back about once every 10 years to give a paper, and so glad that time is now. Thank you very much for coming out on a really hot day, and hello to everyone online as well. So tonight I'm going to talk about part of a book I'm writing, or trying to finish at the moment, called Disability: A History of Resistance, which is a 500-year sweep of disability history from the early modern period to the present. And I'm going to talk about the 18th century, but my head is very much in the 1960s at the moment, which is what I'm writing about. So excuse me if I'm a bit rusty when I'm talking about the 18th century these days.
It's part of the long 18th century.
Yeah, we are colonising the 20th century and beyond. So yeah, I'm going to be talking a bit about that project. Let's start then. On the 7th of January 1748, a quarrel broke out just after 1 o'clock in the afternoon in the London parish of St George, Hanover Square, when one of the churchwardens tried to remove a local beggar to the workhouse. The vagrant, a black man with no legs, refused to move and was quickly joined by a servant of, quote, a certain foreign minister, as a report in the General Evening Post put it, who threatened to, quote, beat out the brains of the parish officer if he did not give the man back his crutches and leave him alone. The constable was called with a warrant for the young servant's arrest, but when he was bundled in a coach to be sent to the nearest magistrate, a mob of 12 to 14 other servants arrived, armed with knives, who set upon the lawman with symbolic disregard for his authority, cut up his staff into pieces. The event was newsworthy, but not isolated. While the problem of unsightly disabled beggars on the streets of London and other cities was regularly reported in the 18th and early 19th century press, officers sometimes faced pushback when they tried to move them on. Francis Hobler, clerk to the Lord Mayor of London, told the Parliamentary Inquiry into London Mendicity in 1816 that there was a well-known blind man who begged at St Paul's the dog that held a bowl in its mouth. If challenged, the man would reply with impudence that it was his dog that begged, not he. And if an officer dared to interfere, the man would stir up crowds of onlookers to cry out, "What, ill-treat a poor blind man?" According to another witness at the same inquiry, disabled mendicants think they have a privilege to beg, and their infirmities cause the people to side with them and defend them, make it impossible for officers to do their duty. We can read these accounts as evidence of concerns about begging and social order, and about the troubling presence of disabled bodies on the streets of London, which call for their removal to places where they would no longer cause offence. But we can also read these incidents as examples of what disability historian Susan Schweik, borrowing from the anthropologist James C. Scott, calls the infrapolitics of disability. Small, barely noticed acts of resistance in which some of the most marginalised members of society claimed a right to be present in public spaces where some people didn't want them. By refusing to move when ordered to do so, by answering back to authority, by mobilising crowds to come to their aid, strategically manipulating the traditional sentiments of pity towards the suffering disabled poor into feelings of solidarity and moral justice. These examples may illustrate the strategies used by the disabled poor to defend themselves in a world where all the odds seem to be stacked against them. Stories of small, everyday acts of resistance on the part of people we tend to think of as being confined to the margins of society are everywhere in history. However, as political acts of defiance in which people with impairments stood up to authority, they've tended to be overshadowed by the more recent campaigns for disability rights that developed in Britain, America, and other countries from the 1960s. Insofar as historians have explored disabled people's acts of resistance in earlier periods, their principal interest has been in movements that provide obvious precursors to modern rights-based activism, such as the National League of the Blind, whose campaign for legally enforceable employment rights for visually impaired workers took shape at the beginning of the 20th century. As such, our understanding of the politics of disablement has been formed within the parameters of the modern disabled people's movement, with a focus on the struggle to secure rights to gain employment, to use public transport, to access public buildings, and to obtain suitable housing. Important as these are, exploring disabled people's political activism through the lens of recent struggles has meant that until recently, historians have neglected not only the multifarious ways and contexts in which people with impairments advocated for themselves in the pre-20th century past, but also the ways in which deformed, maimed, and injured bodies have been politicized in the pursuit of other causes, such as anti-slavery or industrial safety. Tonight, I'm going to draw on research from my forthcoming book that places the modern disabled people's movements within a much longer pattern of disabled people's resistance spanning the last 500 years. And so the question I want to ask is, what does a pre-modern politics of disablement look like? Disability studies scholars Susan Gable and Susan Peters define resistance as, I quote, a way for disabled people to push back against dominance, whilst also attempting to pull society into disabled people's ways of seeing. They also usefully frame disabled people's resistance in wider terms than political struggle alone, to include discourses that challenge tradition. This challenging of tradition, as we'll see, might involve rejecting established social scripts, or it might involve subtly manipulating them in strategic ways to demand better treatment. If the recent history of disabled people's activism has often been loud, proud, and confrontational, before the 19th century, disabled people's resistance was more likely to be individual rather than collective, be framed in moral terms rather than demands for legal rights, and to work within the discursive frameworks of a society that was organized on principles of hierarchy and inequality. In the rest of the talk, I present a history of pre-modern disabled people's resistance by exploring three very different contexts in which people with sick, aged, impaired, or non-standard bodies told stories about their lives. I begin with struggles for welfare justice and negotiations need in early modern petitioning. Next, I explore the visual and discursive strategies by which some people with extraordinary bodies who exhibited themselves to the public sought to capitalize on their fame to invite audiences to look at them in different ways. And then I end by examining how, by the 19th century, blind writers and activists sought to build connections between their own lives and people who'd gone before them, in a precursor to the process of historical recovery that lies at the heart of modern disability history. By doing so, they not only demonstrated the importance of historical knowledge as a tool for fighting oppression, but they also began to think of themselves as having a common identity based on shared bodily experiences that were understood not simply as defects, but as constituting unique ways of knowing the world. Okay, on the 4th of October 1687, a poor man named Thomas Bagshaw dragged his pained and aging body from his home in Brimington in Derbyshire to the market town of Chesterfield, about a mile away, to plead for help at the town's quarter sessions. Bagshaw stood silent before the bench of magistrates as a clerk read out the words of his petition, which described him as a poor ancient man who was so lame that he'd been unable to work for his living for over 2 years. In this incapacitated state, he now faced destitution. Having nothing to live upon and with the winter around the corner, he was now likely to starve to death, the petition said, unless the magistrates granted him some relief. His petition ended with an emotive plea. If the bench could provide him with a weekly allowance to help him get by, then he would forever show his gratitude by each day dropping to his knees and praying for their souls. Bagshaw had first approached his local parish for support, but his claim for poor relief had been denied because other inhabitants of Brimington had accused him of being a counterfeit, someone who was in fact able to work and not as incapacitated as he claimed to be. We have little record of Thomas Bagshaw's life beyond the few lines that make up his petition, but his story is one that resonates across the centuries. For the disabled poor of the early modern period, just like claimants of disability benefits today, the struggle to find adequate support went hand in hand with the struggle to be believed about whether their impairments were genuine. Bagshaw threw himself on the mercy of the magistrates as the ultimate arbiters of local welfare disputes. His petition, like hundreds others at this time, was clothed in humility, pleading with the authorities to gift him what he needed in his moment of desperation. Yet behind the deferential words was a man determined to fight back against the slurs of his neighbours, to challenge the injustice of his treatment in his local community, and to assert an entitlement to relief. In petitioning the magistrates to overturn the decision of the overseers of Brimington to deny him support, Bagshaw desired to be seen not as a harmful stereotype and a lingering fake welfare claimant, but rather as a hard-working, honest man worthy of compassion. Decisions whether to grant poor relief were political in the sense that they involved the social distribution and use of power in local society. To this end, the first political struggles involving disabled people were fought in parish communities and centred on their eligibility and moral deservingness for welfare assistance under the Poor Law statutes passed at the end of Queen Elizabeth I's reign. While most welfare decisions in 17th and 18th century England and Wales went uncontested, it's in moments of dispute that we see most vividly how the poor law operated and how decisions impacted on the lives of disabled people and their families. The primary way of challenging these decisions was via petitioning the magistrates, usually written on behalf of paupers by sympathetic neighbours, clergymen, schoolmasters, or shopkeepers. Petitions comprise unique archives of advocacy, which document the forgotten struggles of the disabled poor to get the support they needed. The so-called impotent poor, people defined by one 17th century legal handbook as those who were aged and decrepit, being past labour, and persons described as naturally disabled, either in wit or member, as the idiot, lunatic, blind, lame, etc., were prominent amongst those challenging welfare decisions in this way. Jonathan Healy, for example, shows that in 17th century Lancashire, nearly half of all surviving petitions on all subjects were from people with physical or mental impairments, particularly older people contesting welfare decisions. Their petitions not just appeal decisions to deny them belief, they also served as negotiations of need, making visible the challenges faced by families in providing adequate care for disabled children or other family members, or supplementing loss of income following disease, injury, or the infirmities of old age. Given that, as Peter Jones and Steve King have argued, most paupers denied relief never used any right to appeal, the significant proportion of older and disabled appellants might reflect a greater sense of injustice caused by denying support to people who had a more obvious claim to support and a perceived greater chance of success from people who displayed infirmities. Although petitions were written documents, the requirement that a claimant appear in person when their petition was read out made appeals legible in alternative ways through the presentation of needful and suffering bodies. Furthermore, the high cost of living for the sick and disabled poor, ranging from fuel to medical bills, might have also motivated more people in this situation to try their luck in appealing decisions that had gone against them. The 1601 Poor Law established an eligibility for poor relief based on the demonstration of need and on a person's belonging to the parish where they claimed assistance, thanks to their settlement there for at least 3 years. Whereas provision was made for the impotent poor, the point at which impotence began was never really defined. And in practice, whether a claimant was looked upon favourably depended more on moral factors than on medicalised measurements of incapacity. Hence, we find many petitioners for poor relief anxious to establish their moral credentials, which often took precedence over an assertion of a legal right to apply for relief. This can be seen in a petition presented by Ellen Rees, a very weak, deaf, infirm person, to the quarter sessions at Northwich in Cheshire in January 1697. For much of her 74 years, she'd never been much burdensome to others, the petition said, and has worked as long as possible. But now, being unable to help herself, she'd become very reliant on the charity and benevolence of her neighbours. Her suffering condition was apparently well known, and therefore the community ought, her petition stated, by the known laws of this land and the principles and dictates of right reason and Christianity, provide something for her reasonable support and maintenance. If one of the key tenets of the modern disabled people's movement has been to separate rights from charity, as radicalised Pudsey Bear is doing on this slide here, in early modern petitions, the two were often conflated, with petitioners appealing to magistrates' pity, generosity, and Christian compassion to provide what the law allowed. The deferential tone of early modern petitions underscores the constrained agency of the disabled poor in addressing authority, yet they also deploy a subtle politics of shaming. By stating that her impairments were well known, Ellen Rees's petition sought to highlight the unfair way she'd been treated, a point further emphasised by her appeal to the principles and dictates of right reason. But beneath the humble tone of petitions lurked hidden transcripts of anger and frustration. Anne Hardy, described as a poor cripple, petitioned the Middlewich Quarter Sessions on the 14th of July 1658 to complain that the overseers and church wardens of her parish had refused to comply with an order she had obtained from the magistrates 7 years previously for a weekly allowance of sixpence. Despite having legal right to relief, a petition explained that local officers had, it said, for the most part, underperformed their duty of care. And despite obtaining a further order to compel payment, she was still, quote, forced to live on the charity of her friends. Although incapable of working for a living, Anne was locked into a cycle of administrative labour, all too familiar to many disabled people today, as she wearily pursued her case. She was not alone. According to Steve Hindle, around a fifth of the petitions relating to poor relief in Cumberland between 1686 and 1749 were appeals from paupers who'd already been granted orders for financial support. It claimed that they hadn't been given what was due to them. By drawing attention to the negligent and unlawful behaviour of the officials responsible for disbursing poor relief, Anne Hardy, like others in her situation, asserted her status as a civil subject deserving of respect, attempting to shame those who wrongly denied her support by reporting her dependence on the kindness of her friends. Above all, petitions articulated an early modern concept of social justice that recognised that in a hierarchical society, the powerful had obligations to the impotent as well as vice versa. Petitions can be seen not so much as efforts to work the system, but as tools by which impoverished people sought to manage unequal social relations in a way that minimised disadvantage. They were strategic appeals to pity in which languages of humility and deference should not be mistaken for passivity and inaction. The act of petitioning gave the so-called impotent poor an opportunity to speak out, albeit in a heavily circumscribed and mediated way, against negligent local officials, to push back against unfair treatment, and to try to negotiate levels of support that they thought were better suited to their needs. And often it worked. Despite neighbourhood attempts to label him as a counterfeit, Thomas Bagshaw was granted a temporary allowance of 8p a week. It was a meagre amount, less than a day's wages for a skilled tradesman, so it's hardly a victory, I suppose, but it held back the threat of starvation, at least for the time being. While Bagshaw couldn't escape poverty, he might have felt some vindication, at least, in having his impairment recognised by people in authority. Thomas Bagshaw's experience of having his impairments scrutinised for signs of imposture was unwelcome attention for someone who only sought to live a quiet, unexceptional life. Being stared at, doubted, or having one's social worth judged on appearance alone are forms of oppression that unite disabled people, past and present. But despite this, some people with so-called remarkable bodies in the long 18th century deliberately sought public attention. By virtue of their talents, unusual appearance, or notoriety, they gained recognition as wonders and curiosities. Public interest in novel bodies meant that becoming disabled was portrayed by some cynical commentators as offering lucrative economic advantages. In his satirical account of London life, The Citizen of the World, published in 1760, Oliver Goldsmith described a seamstress who struggled to earn a living until she happened to suffer an accident that led to both her arms being amputated below the elbow. Anywhere else, wrote Goldsmith, this would have caused her ruin, but such was the demand for sights and monsters in England that now business flowed in apace, and paying spectators flocked to her garret to see the mantua maker who wrought without hands. Human exhibition, particularly that which took place in the back rooms of taverns or at fairgrounds, could be dangerous and exploitive work. Concerns about disorder grew over the course of the century, but as Anne Volker has argued, attending such displays also presented opportunities for people outside of the learned elites to encounter and consider the possibilities for human variation and engage in Enlightenment scientific culture outside of the closed world of the Royal Society. For people with spectacularly unusual bodies, people with missing limbs, conjoined twins, or people of large or small stature, exhibition might provide a way of making a living. Yet by harnessing public interest in their unusual bodies, some performers were able to curate a self-image that challenged audiences to think about physical difference in new ways. Performances were not just about making money, but they're also about changing minds. Advertisements issued on the behalf of performers drew attention to the extraordinary abilities of the people involved rather than their incapacity. For example, the bill on the slide here, which dates from around 1780 and advertises performances by Miss Horton, known as the surprising Warwickshire young lady, described how, having been born without arms, she'd learned to thread a needle, sew, pick needles from a pincushion, and cut out devices in paper using her feet. These everyday adaptations used to make her world more livable were puffed as remarkable talents. She, with her toes, exhibits more to view than hundreds with their fingers e'er could do, boasted the handbill. The language of wonder and admiration that surrounded human display set the stage for performances that embraced non-standard bodies in all their imperfectibility. Performers were at once defective and hyper-able. Some left behind images and accounts of their lives in which they encouraged audiences not just to gawp at them as objects of curiosity, but to behold them as gifted humans living differently in the world. This refashioning of the impaired body in ways that, to use Gable and Peter's phrase, sought to pull society into disabled people's ways of seeing, is perhaps most striking in the self-portraits of Matthias Buckinger and Sarah Biffin, two people on the slide here, talented artists born without limbs, whose careers at either end of the long 18th century began as human exhibits. The work of both these artists has been rediscovered recently, with exhibitions of Buckinger's work in New York in 2015 and Biffin's in London in 2022, which have attempted to reclaim them as disabled artists who challenge societal expectations through creative self-expression. Buckinger originally from Nuremberg, arrived in England around 1716 and entertained audiences with magic tricks, sword throwing, and displays of musicianship, while all the time seeking elite patronage for his work as an artist. His self-portrait, commissioned by the bookseller Isaac Herbert in 1724, served both as an advertisement for his artistic abilities and as a projection of status. He portrayed himself, as the image shows here, in an oval frame surrounded by an elaborate engraving, sitting on a cushion and dressed in a wig and coat. He made no attempt to hide his stumps, and in an accompanying text, he proudly listed his accomplishments, including marrying 4 times, fathering 11 children. In the early 18th century, the portrait genre was rapidly being adopted by lawyers, merchants, and other social climbers as a vehicle for projecting their position as self-made men. By adopting this format for himself, Buckinger challenged his audience's expectations about what bodies were deserving of esteem. Rather than being ashamed of his difference, his expression proudly meets the viewer's gaze. His was an image of disabled success, demanding respect from his audience for both his talent and his virility. Sarah Biffen, whose artistic career reached its height 100 years later, was sometimes compared with Buckinger and was considered by some as even more remarkable in her talents, since her limbs were much shorter than his, and lacking the cleft or fork in his stump that Buckinger had, she was entirely reliant on her mouth to move her brush. But the differences between the two went beyond physical attributes. Her artistry had first drawn public attention when she was displayed in fairgrounds across Britain by the artist and showman James Dukes as a teenager. As a woman seeking to make a living in the early 19th century art world, Sarah Biffen was not just disabled in body, she was also disabled by her gender. At a time when the Royal Academy denied membership to women, Biffen drew on her early fame as a human exhibit to gain a freedom to promote her work that was denied to other creative women at the time, by advertising her paintings under her own name as a work of the celebrated artist born without hands or arms. She painted a series of miniature self-portraits, some of which depicted her manner of working, using her mouth to move a paintbrush, which was attached by a loop to the sleeve of her dress. Like Buckinger, she made no attempt to conceal her body difference, yet she discreetly hid her stumps in her sleeves. Instead, the viewer's eyes are drawn to her soft facial features, and in many of her portraits, to her flamboyant headgear festooned with feathers, as shown in this portrait here. While she traded on her novelty as a painter without hands, her portraits presented her as a fashionable, respectable, and successful woman whose defiance of social conventions went far beyond her bodily difference. The expansion of print media in the 18th century enabled people celebrated for their curious embodiment to capitalize on their fame, to push back against stereotypes, and to present alternative narratives of living with a non-standard body. A striking example of this is the autobiographical memoir penned by the so-called celebrated Polish dwarf, Józef Browalski, shown here. Born in Halich in Polish Russia, which is today's Ukraine, to a noble family that had fallen on hard times, Browalski was resident in England and approaching his 50th birthday when he published the first of 4 editions of his life story in 1788. As a youth, he'd been invited to join the household of the Polish noblewoman, Countess Humieska, with whom he travelled through Central Europe, where he was presented to nobility and monarchs, including King Stanislaus of Poland and the Habsburg Empress Maria Theresa. He did not see his appearances in royal courts or royal households as a form of exhibition, but they followed in a tradition of people with small stature being kept for the purpose of entertainment by European rulers. Such figures occupied a valued position and were treated affectionately, but they were essentially owned by their noble keepers, served as projections of their status and were considered objects of fascination rather than fully human. While Borovsky was always grateful towards the noblemen and women who received him and supported him through gifts, he was also conscious that they objectified him, lamenting that they often looked upon him as a doll or an animated toy, as he put it. By the time he published his memoirs, Borovsky's circumstances had changed. He was no longer the childlike plaything of the European elite, but a middle-aged man with a family to support, now reliant on doing paid performances to get by. Publishing his life story was a means of securing his and their future welfare, and of advertising his talents to those who might hire him to perform. He also saw it as an opportunity to capitalize on his fame to educate others about so-called dwarfs. Early editions of his memoirs were influenced by the confessional style of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who sought to build a sympathetic connection with readers through empathy with the author's emotions. Borovsky's autobiography set out not only to provide an entertaining account of his travels, but also to present its author as a man of feeling. His example would prove, he wrote, that the smallness of our stature does not prevent us from experiencing the power of the passions. His stated aim was to challenge the views of people who, he said, are wont to look upon beings of my stature as, quote, abortive, half-grown individuals, kept far beneath other men, both in body and mind. His message was clear. Restricted growth did not mean diminished humanity. For one whose fame derived from his unconventional embodiment, Borovsky was at pains to challenge the idea that he was not, in his words, merely physical and devoid of moral sense. This is seen particularly vividly in the most shocking incident described in the memoir, when, during their stay at Vienna, he described overhearing a conversation between his benefactress and several nobles about whether dwarfism was a hereditary condition. The Countess had told the company about his siblings, particularly his younger sister, whose diminutive proportions at only 2 feet 2 inches in height were even more remarkable than his own. He heard her confide in the company that she'd often wondered how pleasant it would be how pleasant it would be to join these two creatures sexually, to settle the question of whether a union between two dwarfs would produce a child of similar proportions. Borovsky was appalled not only by hearing others imagining him conjoined incestuously with his sister, but also by the implication that he was to them simply a body to be objectified, a mere physical entity onto which could be projected the grossest sexual fantasies. To further present himself as more than his physical appearance, Borovsky gave considerable attention to his romantic fortunes, particularly his long and often painful courtship of his future wife, Estelina, the Countess's young companion. It was in matters of the heart, he wrote, that he most, quote, bitterly felt all the disadvantages of his stature, which made others treat him like an infantile plaything. The more I endeavoured to display my sentiments and to speak to her as a man, he wrote, the more she delighted in ridiculing them and treating me as a child. Romantic disappointment led to him falling into a heavy melancholy, a deep, lovelorn despair, which eventually proved to the object of his affections that his feelings were sincere rather than a childish infatuation or mere imitation of love. The confessional memoir helped enable Borovsky to exercise a kind of emotional resistance, allowing him to self-present as a man of feeling, small in stature, yet full of emotional depth. In this respect, his book bears some resemblance with William Hayes' famous Deformity and Essay, published in 1754, in which the Member of Parliament for Seaford in Sussex, who lived with spinal curvature and sight loss, described how the mockery and abuse he endured as a person living with physical difference acted as a spur to his emotional growth, deepening his sense of sympathy towards the sufferings of others. Broflovski's memoir also sought to capitalise on the popularity of fictions of sensibility, as well as a growing public interest in not just viewing, but reading about the lives of unusual people. Late 18th century biographical collections routinely included accounts of men and women who were remarkable or extraordinary in their abilities or appearances. In his multi-volume biographical history of England, first published in 1769, for instance, the Reverend James Granger divided his subjects into 12 classes, ranging from royalty and great officers of state to persons of both sexes, he wrote, chiefly of the lowest order of people, remarkable from only one circumstance in their lives, namely those who lived to a great age, or deformed persons, etc. Figures from 18th century London street life, like Blind Granny, who is shown on the slide here, a woman whose party piece was to lick her empty eye sockets with her elongated tongue in return for beer money, were included in 18th century works of national biography, as the lives of eccentrics rubbed up against those of the great and the good. If such works tended to include people with unusual bodies primarily for the purposes of mockery or entertainment, then James Wilson's biography of the blind, first published in 1821, fundamentally changed the ways in which disabled people's histories were gathered together. Wilson was a visually impaired furniture upholsterer who discovered a passion for literature after joining the Belfast Literary Society in 1804, where he had books read to him by obliging fellow members, or sometimes he had books read to him by his clients as he worked for them. Wilson first announced his intention to publish what he called a species of biography hitherto untouched on a matter as yet unknown in the Belfast Monthly magazine in August 1814. 7 years later, after relentless travel through Ireland to gather subscribers for his project, Biography of the Blind was published by a local bookseller. It would go through 4 editions over the following 20 years, gaining its author many admirers and well-wishers, according to a newspaper report on his death in 1846. Heather Tilley, in her book Blindness and Writing, published in 2018, describes it as a significant move towards documenting the experience of blindness from the perspective of blind and visually impaired people. But the book remains relatively little known. As the first attempt to collect and indeed to connect blind people's lives across time and space, it may justly lay claim to be a foundational text of disability history. Biography of the Blind was written, its author explains, with a view of rescuing my fellow sufferers from the neglect and obscurity in which many of them were involved. He considered sightless people as a distinctive social class, it's a term that Wilson uses, seemingly separated from society by the loss of sight, whose shared experiences gave them something in common, regardless of their wealth or background. Wilson's aim was to show how there are many instances in history in which blind people have proven themselves capable of what he said was overcoming those difficulties, which would have been thought unsurmountable. The book created a lineage of blind people who'd excelled in literary, cultural, and scientific achievements, from the ancient Greek poet Homer, described by Wilson as the most extraordinary genius that any age or country has yet produced, to more recent worthies such as the Cambridge mathematician Nicholas Sanderson, Swiss naturalist Francis Huber, and a handful of female examples such as Anna Williams, the Welsh poet who became a close friend of Samuel Johnson. This was a hopeful history, written to exemplify the powers of the human mind in the face of adversity. Dedicated to Molyneux's Asylum for Blind People in Dublin, Wilson's work reflected a growing optimism in blind people's intellectual potential, shared by the founders of new educational institutions, which opened their doors from the 1790s onwards. Although Wilson described sight loss as a misfortune, one of the greatest privations known to humanity, as he put it, he also presented disablement as an opportunity, which birthed new qualities of character and resilience. The longest biography in Wilson's collection was his own, detailing his birth in revolutionary Virginia, his orphaning when both his parents perished at sea as his loyalist family escaped to Britain, and his dogged determination to build an independent life for himself in Ireland, where at the age of 4, he'd been put into the care of a nurse following his parents' demise. By placing his own life story alongside those of his historical subjects, Wilson claimed community with those who'd gone before him. He was especially drawn to blind people who demonstrated the same spirit of self-reliance that he valued in himself. If his subjects had overcome the privations that came through the loss of sight, then it was through the ingenious ways that they'd use their embodied knowledge as people who experience the world differently that they'd done that, rather than by trying to assimilate with oculus-centric norms. Wilson sought to educate his sighted audience on how blind people experience the world differently, discussing, for instance, the zigzag manner of walking that he had adopted to better understand his environment and its dangers when traversing the lanes of his neighbourhood in his previous work as a deliverer of letters and newspapers. Of Hugh James, the blind physician who practiced medicine in Carlisle at the end of the 18th century, Wilson wrote that not only did he bear the loss of his sight caused by inflammation of his eyes with exemplary patience and fortitude, his disablement might actually have made him a better doctor, since he had to diagnose complaints by touch rather than through visual signs such as skin tone. For internal disorders, he wrote, a blind physician has the advantage of a more acute sense of feeling and is able to form a very correct opinion of the seat and nature of these complaints. Like Hay before him, Wilson also argued that the difficulties faced by people who had experienced sight loss made them more empathetic to the sufferings of others, a point he illustrated via the anti-slavery campaigning of the radical Liverpool poet Edward Rushton. These characteristics were, he boasted, advantages which those who are blessed with sight do not possess. At a time when sight was lauded as the sovereign of the senses, this was a radical message indeed. History, as James Wilson recognised over 200 years ago, is a powerful tool in challenging assumptions about disability. Knowing that people in the past fought and sometimes won battles with poor law officials to have their claims to support recognised helps to legitimise the struggles of many in the present to get the assistance they need, albeit in ever more difficult circumstances. It's important that we don't romanticise these struggles. Petitioning may have been a means of challenging welfare decisions and shaming recalcitrant officials, but they're also snapshots of lives in crisis. At the start of this year, news emerged that the UK government paid £50,000 to suppress a review into the death of Errol Graham, a disabled man who starved to death in his own home in 2018 after the Department for Work and Pensions stopped his benefits. The denial of support has real consequences. His death should remind us that when early modern petitioners claimed that they might starve through inability to buy food or freeze due to lack of fuel or clothing, these weren't simply rhetorical strategies to win the support of the powerful, but were also real statements of need. It also shows us that disabled people's history is not a simple arc of progress. Yet this history offers moments of hope that show that the oppression of people with non-standard bodies in the past did not go unchallenged. The disability rights movement may be a recent development, but for centuries disabled people have resisted poor treatment and tried to draw others into their worlds to try to liberate them from their prejudices. James Wilson's writing would go on to inspire a new generation of blind activists in mid-Victorian England who also looked to the past to support campaigns for the social, educational and employment rights of visually impaired people. Let me close with an example of how 18th century disability history was used in the pursuit of justice in a long forgotten episode concerning the treatment of a blind musician by a City of London church in 1856. The appointment of one Miss Northcote to the position of organist at the Church of St. Anne and St. Agnes had been opposed by a very strong party of parishioners and officials. Despite being a talented player, she was a victim of a growing prejudice against blind organists, fueled by occasional acts of charity, which had led to some substandard players being appointed by London churches. This had in turn led some to publicly question the ability of all blind musicians. Miss Northcote's case was taken up by William Hanks Levy, a formidable campaigner on behalf of his fellow blind people, who articulated the struggles of the blind as those of an oppressed minority. He wrote a letter to the Musical Gazette, reminding its readers of the long history of blind organists and composers going back to the 18th century prodigy, John Stanley. His performances had delighted Handel, who had himself lost his sight in later life. The parish relented, and Miss Northcote was appointed with a salary of £40 a year. In his book Blindness and the Blind, published in 1872, Levy made an impassioned argument for blind people to know their history, not just to celebrate the achievements of people in the past, as Wilson had done, but as a tool to fight oppression in the present. It's a message that should resonate with all deaf, disabled, and neurodivergent people today, and with everyone else too. Thanks very much.